The meeting between President Donald Trump and President Volodymyr Zelensky was more than a bilateral encounter. It was a performance in layered diplomacy, with the press as witness and the world as the intended audience. The American president opened with deliberate confidence, noting progress, very substantial progress, and emphasizing that momentum toward peace was now a real possibility. He framed the gathering not as an isolated dialogue, but as part of a wider choreography, pointing out his earlier meeting with President Vladimir Putin and announcing that 7 powerful European leaders were waiting to convene immediately afterward. In the logic of geopolitics, such sequencing was not accidental. Trump made clear that the United States was placing itself at the center of a triangle. Washington speaking to Moscow, Washington speaking to Kyiv, and Washington convening Europe. In this structure, the White House became indispensable, the sole broker capable of binding adversaries and allies into the same frame. President Zelensky responded with visible gratitude, thanking Trump for personal efforts to halt the killings, to stop the war, and even extending appreciation to the American First Lady, who had sent a letter to Vladimir Putin on the sensitive matter of abducted Ukrainian children. The symbolism was profound. War is often waged through steel and fire, but diplomacy can be waged through images of children and mothers. Zelensky carefully emphasized that this format, the trilateral arrangement with European powers encircling it, was a demonstration of international unity around Ukraine. United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, the European Union, and NATO all were named, a ritual of inclusion that reminded both Moscow and Washington that Kyiv was not alone. Yet Zelensky understood, and the audience understood, that the decisive dynamic was the triangle between himself, Trump, and Putin. The others were orbiting stars, their light real but derivative. The questions from the press quickly exposed the fault lines. One journalist contrasted Zelensky's insistence that Russia must end the war with Trump's claim that Zelensky himself could end it almost immediately. Trump's reply was characteristic. He said he believed a trilateral meeting could occur, and if it did, there was a reasonable chance to end the war. The phrasing was carefully chosen. He did not say certainty, but probability. He did not assign blame to one side, but emphasized opportunity. When pressed on whether this marked the end of American support, he rejected the notion outright, stressing that, with so many lives lost in the last week alone, no one could yet speak of finality. He referenced millions of dead across 4 years in exaggeration, but a deliberate one, reminding the audience of scale, of carnage, of urgency. His emphasis was not on precise numbers, but on moral weight. The implication was that continuation without resolution was intolerable, and that leadership required risk. The conversation shifted to power balance. Which side held the better cards, Russia or Ukraine? Trump refused to answer. Instead, he distanced himself from ownership of the war. "This is not my war," he said. "This is Joe Biden's war." The statement was at once political and strategic. By framing it as the consequence of Biden's mismanagement, Trump reduced American responsibility while amplifying his own role as the potential resolver. It was both domestic positioning and international signaling. Zelensky, confronted with a sharp question about whether he would continue sending troops to die or redraw the maps, responded emotionally. He described the daily reality of attacks, the wounded, and the death of a child only 1.5 years old. His words carried the human cost, appealing for support from America and Europe, but also aligning himself with Trump's declared pursuit of a diplomatic finish. He explicitly endorsed the idea of a trilateral meeting, calling it a very good signal. It was the acceptance of a framework that could bring both hope and compromise. A journalist raised the question of American peacekeepers. Would the United States send troops to guarantee any settlement? Trump's answer was cautious. He promised long-term peace, not a temporary truce. He insisted that any peace must endure, not collapse after 2 years. He said America would work with Ukraine, with Russia, and with others to ensure it lasted. He left open the possibility of security guarantees, but deferred specifics to later meetings with European leaders. The message was layered. The United States would not shoulder this alone, but it would remain engaged. This is consistent with Trump's broader strategy, placing costs on allies while maintaining American leverage as the indispensable partner. Zelensky himself reinforced this, pointing out that partners across NATO and Europe would contribute. For him, the assurance that America remained central was already a victory, even if the precise mechanisms of security remained undefined. Then came the deeper question: what are the root causes of this war? A journalist cited Putin's claim that the war would not end unless those causes were addressed. Trump avoided a direct explanation, saying simply that the war would end when it ended, that both Zelensky and Putin wanted it to end, and that the world was tired. Yet he did more than avoid. He reframed, placing this war within a continuum of conflicts. He cited India and Pakistan, Africa, Rwanda, and Congo, wars stretching 31 years or more. He noted that he had ended 6 wars already, that he had even obliterated Iran's nuclear capability as a threat. He presented himself as a deal-maker, across a span of conflicts, positioning this one as difficult but solvable. The analysis is clear. Trump was reframing Ukraine not as an exceptional case, but as one more conflict in a global pattern. By doing so, he reduced Moscow's claim to unique grievances and elevated Washington's claim to unique capacity to resolve. The conversation turned again to Europe. What did European leaders need to see in order to support peace? Trump described them as powerful friends, all eager to see peace, all ready with suggestions. He reinforced their role as supporting actors, but made clear that Washington remained director of the stage. Then came the pointed question: would a lasting peace be fair if Ukraine ceded territories not yet conquered by Russia? Trump sidestepped. He said there would be a lasting peace, one that he hoped would be immediate, and one that would make the world happy. Again, the emphasis was not on maps but on outcomes. For Zelensky, the challenge was acute. His legitimacy at home rests on territorial integrity, but his survival as a wartime president depends on peace. Trump's refusal to specify meant leaving open the possibility of compromise without committing America to advocate for it. This is the logic of negotiation. Keep options open, signal possibility, defer cost. A journalist shifted to symbolism. The First Lady's letter to Putin, appealing on behalf of children, was raised. Was it because she believed Putin was the aggressor? Trump's answer emphasized her compassion, her love of children, her sorrow at funerals. He described the letter as beautiful, well-received, and motivated by love of children. This was not just sentimentality. It was soft power signaling that America's leadership touched both battlefield and family. It presented the United States not only as negotiator among men of power, but as protector of innocence. In geopolitics, such gestures are part of the arsenal. They soften perceptions, shape narratives, and create moral pressure. By invoking children, funerals, and the sorrow of parents, Trump sought to wrap hard negotiations in moral legitimacy. The exchange then shifted to elections. Could Ukraine hold elections in wartime? Zelensky said yes, in principle, but not during active fighting. Security and a temporary truce would be required. This was not just democratic ritual, but a question of legitimacy. For Ukraine to continue as a sovereign democracy, elections were necessary. For Russia, denial of elections would be evidence of authoritarian drift. For the United States, insisting on elections allowed Washington to present itself as guardian of democratic norms even while negotiating compromise. Trump seized on the statement, quipping that in America no elections would mean outrage, hinting at the press and its bias. He expanded the theme into criticism of the American media, accusing them of not wanting peace, of being hostile regardless of outcome. He claimed that even if he gained Moscow and St. Petersburg for Ukraine, the press would declare it a bad deal. He framed himself as peacemaker scorned, yet undeterred. This was as much a domestic message as international. He was reminding his base that media cannot be trusted, that he alone delivers results, that legitimacy comes from the people, not the press. From there, the press conference became a showcase of Trump's dual messaging. On the one hand, he recounted wars he claimed to have ended. conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, portraying himself as consistent resolver. On the other hand, he attacked the press as dishonest, biased, incapable of recognizing achievements. The juxtaposition was deliberate: competence abroad, persecution at home. He even inserted anecdotes about Washington, D.C., now safe under his rule, where friends could once again dine in restaurants, where even walking with controversial allies like Marjorie Taylor Greene no longer invited attack. This was not accidental filler. It was a narrative of order restored domestically, mirrored by order sought internationally. In cold logic, such rhetoric serves to reinforce legitimacy. If a leader can restore order at home, he can impose order abroad. A sharp question returned to Ukraine. Would there be severe consequences if no ceasefire was achieved? Trump rejected the need for ceasefires altogether. He explained that his 6 peace deals of the year were concluded without ceasefires. Ceasefires, he argued, allow rebuilding and rearming. They are temporary pauses that advantage one side. He conceded that the concept had appeal because it halts killing immediately, but he emphasized that real peace must be built while fighting continues. This was an insight into his negotiation style. Do not pause, do not freeze lines, but push toward permanent resolution. In Ukraine, this meant pressing both sides toward settlement without creating a window for strategic regrouping. It was a hard-nosed, transactional approach, one that diverged from traditional diplomatic calls for ceasefire. For Trump, the goal was decisive, not temporary. The matter of NATO guarantees surfaced. Would Ukraine receive Article 5-like protection? Trump reminded the audience that long before Putin, it was declared Ukraine would not enter NATO. He said discussions had not yet occurred, but promised strong protection, very good security. He left undefined the exact shape, but reassured that like-minded partners were prepared. This was classic strategic ambiguity, enough to reassure Ukraine, vague enough to avoid binding commitments. For Putin, it preserved space. For Europe, it signaled burden sharing. For Washington, it kept leverage. The structure was intact. The United States promised protection, without spelling the price. Then the question of money emerged. America had already given hundreds of billions, yet the war remained stalemated. How much more would the United States give? Trump answered sharply, none. America is not giving, it is selling. He contrasted this with Biden's policy of giveaways, corruption, and incompetence. He reminded the audience of $300 billion, perhaps $350 billion already spent under Biden. He insisted that under his administration, this war would never have occurred. He accused Biden of corruption going back 40 years, of incompetence then and now. He declared that if the election had been properly resolved, the war would not have begun, millions would not have died, and millions would not have been displaced. This was more than attack. It was reframing the entire conflict as preventable, avoidable, and the direct consequence of American mismanagement. It was a declaration that leadership matters, that wars are not inevitable, but the product of policy choices. In doing so, Trump not only criticized Biden, but presented himself as the unique alternative, the man whose presence prevents war. Zelensky then explained Ukraine's position. They were thankful to buy weapons from America, financed through NATO programs and European partners. He emphasized air defense, Patriots, and bilateral production arrangements with the United States. This was not just procurement, it was integration. By buying American, Ukraine tied its defense directly to U.S. industry, ensuring alignment beyond battlefield to supply chain. For Trump, this was a victory. Ukraine dependent on American systems, America profiting from sales, Europe footing part of the bill. He praised the Patriots as nearly 100% effective, the best in the world. He described the technology as bullets colliding midair, foolproof. This was both marketing and signaling. It reminded allies that American defense technology remains unmatched, and reminded Russia that Ukraine's shield would be American-made. It was also political. Under Trump, the United States profits from security sales. Under Biden, the United States gives away treasure. At this stage, the press veered off into domestic matters, questioning mail-in ballots. Trump used the opportunity to declare them corrupt, fraudulent, and vowed to end them by executive order. Though seemingly off-topic, it linked back to legitimacy. Just as Ukraine needed secure elections after war, America needed secure elections before leadership. He portrayed mail-in ballots as the one thing preventing honest democracy, invoking even Jimmy Carter's warnings. For him, borders and elections were the twin pillars of sovereignty. Without them, no country could survive. By connecting electoral reform at home to war termination abroad, he bound domestic order to international leadership. The narrative was seamless. To bring peace abroad, America must have integrity at home. The final questions returned to guarantees. What security would Ukraine receive to agree to a deal? Zelensky said everything was needed: a strong army, weapons, intelligence, training, and partner commitments. Trump replied that NATO-like protection was under discussion, that Europeans were eager, and that America would support. He emphasized again that European leaders were in the next room, waiting to give protection. The choreography was complete. Zelensky asking, Europeans waiting, Trump mediating. The message to Putin was clear. The message to Kyiv was clear. The message to Europe was clear. Only Washington could convene all sides. Only Washington could broker peace. In closing, Trump emphasized his knowledge of the Ukrainian people: smart, energetic, loving their country. He declared love for Russians as well, portraying himself as above enmity, seeking to stop war for all. He reminded the audience that he had spoken with Putin, would call him after the meeting, and that if a trilateral meeting occurred, there was a good chance of ending the conflict. If not, the fighting would continue. With that, the press conference ended. Reporters ushered out, leaders moving on to the next stage. But the strategic message was already complete. In cold logic, the meaning is clear. Trump positioned himself as indispensable broker. Zelensky positioned himself as grateful partner. Putin, though absent, was cast as potential participant. Europe was placed in orbit, supportive but secondary. The war was framed not as endless but as solvable, not as moral crusade but as transaction. Children and funerals provided the moral pressure. Weapons and money provided the leverage. Elections provided the legitimacy. At the center, the United States projected itself as the decisive actor, with a president confident that resolution was near. Whether the world accepts that resolution, whether maps are redrawn, whether alliances fracture or hold, remains uncertain. But the structure of negotiation was made visible, and the architecture of potential peace was laid out for all to see.